Serious, 911 operators of Reddit, what is a call that keeps you up at night? It was 9:30 a.m. I'd been on shift since 7 a.m. All the ambulances had checked in for morning mileage and radio checks. All was good. A call comes in on the emergency line. My son is not breathing. Okay, we got this. Start going through the steps of checking for a pulse or breath while dispatching the closest ambulance. I'm almost to the part where we start CPR when the ambulance calls back, "Dispatch, our rig is dead." You got to be fucking kidding me. You called in this morning with a radio check. Did you not check your goddamn ambulance? Nearest ambulance is one whole county over. 30 minutes. 30 minutes for a situation that needs immediate medical intervention. The mother is screaming on the phone crying. The sister comes in and starts screaming the name of her brother. I have to tell them the ETA for an ambulance is 30 minutes. It's been almost 10 years since I was in EMS dispatch, and I occasionally wake up in a cold sweat thinking about that call. I was a dispatcher about 17 years ago. There were some funny calls I like to talk about, like the person who wanted to complain that their drug dealer stole their laptop. The one I don't like the most is the long call with the woman who was concerned about the landlord who didn't like her, and her boyfriend was in the background confirming her statements that the landlord was creepy. They found her body floating in the river the next day, except it turned out it was the boyfriend who killed her. Also, the recorded calls you have to listen to during training where they intentionally play you the sound of people dying on the phone while talking to a dispatcher so that you understand what the job might entail, and they can see how you react to it to see if you can stomach it and keep talking and providing details to units. 1 a.m., and the phone rings, and I pick up to hear a man screaming on the other end. No words. Just screaming. Finally, get in to tell me what happened, and he told me he heard a gunshot in his house and went to see what happened and found his brother in his room. He had shot himself. I got a 911 call about a vehicle that ran off the road. The caller told me that the female driver was unconscious but had a pulse. He then proceeded to tell me that the passenger was a fatal. I asked if he had checked for a pulse, at which point, he told me no. It was a young child that had been decapitated. I asked him to find anything he could to cover the child because I didn't want the mother to regain consciousness and have that be the last image she had of her child. I had a witness to a fatal motorcycle collision on the phone with me, and he goes, "Someone's crossing the road to help. Oh my God, she just got hit by a car. She's dead too." And he just screamed and hung up. An off-duty nurse who stopped to help the motorcycle rider was hit by another car and killed. It was on the news later, and I found out she had a husband and 2 very young kids. I was on workers' comp for about 3 weeks while I recovered from that one. I'm a firefighter, and I overheard a call on the radio from another unit. They were dispatched to a possible suicide. The information given while the crews were en route was, patient's wife came home and found a note on the point door saying, "Honey, I'm already gone if you're reading this. Please do not come in and see me like this." The crews arrived, and the next thing you heard on the radio was the paramedic telling dispatch code 4, meaning patient is deceased, and in the background, you can hear the wife screaming bloody murder as loud as she could. It was chilling. So, I've had plenty of heartbreaking calls, but the one that actually keeps me up is because it was so weird and disturbing rather than tragic. So set up, I work medical, and we cover a fairly large geographic area. Calls come over with minimal info from the first call takers, so we know the location and that it's a medical issue. Okay, tell me exactly what happened? Standard first question. A young-sounding woman replies pretty calmly but energetically. "My back hurts, and Uncle Ricky is real." She proceeded to explain that she had chronic back pain, and that she'd been in the hospital the day before because of it. But they didn't refill her meds while she was there. And Uncle Ricky made her throw her old ones out. The more we talked, the more irrational and erratic her answers got. I ask her to make sure the door is unlocked, and pets are put away, and she says the door is open. Then she tells me about her cat and that it's already outside. Don't tell Uncle Ricky about her cat. He made them kill the last cat she had. Her dad and her cousins. They killed all the cats. But they're locked up now. She named off all her cats for me. There were a lot. She mentions that there's a Sasquatch outside. She can see its eyes in the woods. She kept this up for 20 minutes. Just before the ambulance arrives, she starts talking to someone who got there first. It's a patrol car that had been quietly sent. The first thing the officer asks after addressing her by name, which wasn't the one, she told me, "How did you get inside this house?" There was a logic in her rambling, a terrible consistency about her Uncle Ricky. But there were plenty of random mental health delusions in her conversation. And she was 30 miles out of town in a house that wasn't hers. I don't know what happened to her or what had happened to her, how much of what she told me was real or fantasy, of nightmarish delusion meant to lie to herself. I wonder whose house she was in, where they were, or why she picked that house. What was out in the woods looking at her? Was there even a cat there? Was Uncle Ricky actually real? In the end, long mental health calls trouble me the most. Delusional people tell almost believable stories with deep honesty. They've told me about werewolves and demons and ghosts at the foot of their bed. Some say their upstairs neighbor is poisoning them when they live alone. Most of the time, there is no follow-up on what was really happening, at least for the call takers. Wondering how truthful the strange, frightening stories keep me up at night. Not quite sure if this counts, but my father works EMS. If you get a proper segue into the topic, he will tell you about the worst calls he's been on. The worst call I've heard was a suicide. Never a good case. He remembers arriving and seeing the guy's troubled loved ones. He made his way to the bedroom and got the scene of the bloody and gory mess ingrained into his head permanently. It was a suicide by a 12-gauge blast to the face. He didn't eat for a few days and had to take off work to digest the incident. It doesn't keep me up at night, but I do think about it from time to time. Had a daughter call in for her elderly mother experiencing chest pains. 10 minutes pass, and I call for an ETA. They tell me they're there. The daughter gave me the wrong address they had recently moved to, and she gave the old address. The chest pains turned to trouble breathing. ETA 10 minutes. Mother isn't responding. The daughter is crying over the line. Paramedics arrive, perform CPR and even use the defibrillator. Sadly, she didn't make it. I heard all this over the phone at the time. It hit me a bit hard, but you get over it. 999 call taker and radio dispatcher from the UK here. One of my scariest calls came from a man who was on a train viaduct, which was at least 200 feet high and was planning on jumping. He was 19 years old and had just lost his mother to cancer and had no other family to speak of. Now our control room had CCTV cameras from around the towns and cities that we covered, and I shouted across the room for someone to bring the camera up that covered the viaduct for me. Sure enough, around halfway along the viaduct and leaning precariously against the high rail, was the guy I was talking to. I introduced myself and said that I could see where he was and that I hoped we could talk and get him to come down and get help. So, I'm talking to this lovely, quietly spoken man who is crying softly as he speaks to me, saying he has nothing left to live for. His mother had been the center of his whole life, especially so since she had contracted cancer and he had cared for her alone. As I am talking to him and trying to convince him to climb down, I hear a radio call in my earpiece and my supervisor frantically shouting that a train is coming along that line, and unless we get this man off the viaduct, he won't have to jump as the high-speed train is going to hit him. At this point, I am literally shaking, pleading with the man to get to one of the small setback areas on the viaduct used by rail workers. He luckily agrees, and I tell him to stay on the call as he starts making his way as quick as he can to the nearest safe point. I can hear his labored, panicked breathing through my earpiece, and suddenly I hear the unmistakable sound of the train approaching, and the noise is so loud I can no longer hear the man I'm talking to, so all I can do is listen to the sound of the train racing past. Then it's silent. I hardly dare speak. I say the man's name. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" Finally, in a shaky voice, he answers and says he is safe and just shaken up. He walks to the end of the viaduct, where he is met by police officers and an ambulance and is taken off to the hospital, and that's the last I speak to him. This call is as clear in my mind as the day I answered it. I can still remember the feeling of absolute terror as the train approached and being terrified that was, he not quick enough, he was going to suffer a horrific death. Some things never leave your memories. I just pray he went on to live a happy, healthy life. I was a medical dispatcher in Canada for a few years until I moved on to other things. Cool job, but not a lot of upward or even lateral movement from there. In Canada, we have some really rural places. If you start looking far enough to the north, it'll get dicey weather or not you even have drivable roads to some places. Your nearest dispatch could be 2-3 hours away, even longer. We got a call in for a labor in progress in one of these areas. Contractions were coming fast. I was on the line with the husband guiding him through the process, getting some towels, a blanket, a safety pin, positioning the mother, all that. I could hear the mom talking with him in the background in between contractions. She sounded good. They were really excited, a little scared, as you would be. It was late at night, and as typical, we didn't have a lot of call takers on. Another emergency call came in, so I chucked them to another line, told them to keep it up, And I'd be back in a minute and bounce to answer the next call, minor situation, quick dispatch. A couple of minutes, easy, everyone in the room was giving me the look. Assisting with birth is a bit of a dispatch rite of passage, and this kid was coming now. Everyone was all smiling. I'm feeling like a champ. I key back to the procedure for guiding a birth and flip back over to mom and dad's line. It turned so fast. I was only gone, maybe 2 minutes, and it turned so fast. Mom was bleeding. A lot. Too much. Way too much. In those 2 minutes, she went from sounding fine, if agonized, to death's door. Dad tells me she's white as a sheet, gushing blood. She's getting faint. Just stay with me, honey. Don't go, please don't go, they're on the way, they'll be here soon. Just stay with me. The ambulance is still well over 90 minutes out. No RCMP nearby to respond. No first responders. They're out there, in the sticks, on their own. I hear her say goodbye to her husband. I hear him cry. Oh my God, please, wake up, she's not breathing. He's hysterical. But we can't be hysterical. We have to keep her blood moving. My blood is ice cold, there are tears in my eyes, and I choke that shit back because we need to rein this dude in and get hands on the chest for CPR. There's not really any great way to manage internal bleeding as a civ on the scene, so we do what we can. We pump her heart. For an hour, longer, I don't know. At some point, I just blocked it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Pushing hard and fast, at least 2 inches deep. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't really remember what happened, but I was on the line with him until paramedics arrived on the scene, and then just as suddenly, they were gone from my life. Families discovering suicides were also the worst. Dreadful. Hubby of a former dispatcher, she worked nights by herself, and I think, hadn't even worked a year there. Knew the officers really well since obviously she was the only person there. An officer pulls a guy over for a routine stop, but for whatever reason, he pulled a gun and shot the officer, then took off. The officer calls into dispatch, so she's calling EMTs and all that and gives the mile marker. From my understanding, other cops got on the scene first, and were with him. EMT calls back for the location, and she somehow gave the wrong one, off by like a mile. She was pretty shaken by it as it was someone she considered a friend. He lived. She found out later about the mix-up like a week later. It didn't seem to affect anything or delay him getting help, but it messed her up worse. Got put on leave, and no one in the department could talk to her. I got PTSD from it and was in a bad place for a while. She's much better now and no longer a dispatcher. One thing that makes me horrified to this day was when I was first starting out as a 911 operator. I picked up the phone, and I heard an older woman on the line say that someone was in her house, and she didn't have anyone or anything to protect her. She then told me that she was hiding and whoever it was coming near her. I then heard silence on the line. I later found out she was kidnapped and never found. I still have nightmares about that day, and I wish there was something I could do. Been working as a police call taker for 3 months. We take calls from multiple police jurisdictions. We cover a large area and a variety of communities. A couple of highlights from my short time here so far. A mother, who found her son's suicide note in his bedroom. We go through the standard questions: last known location, cell phone, description, method, mode of travel, previous history, etc. While I was waiting for members to arrive at her home, she told me about him and how he was supposed to go on a 7-day trip with the Coast Guard the next day. The phrase she said that sticks with me is, "My heart is in my boots," not a popular saying where I'm from. Members arrive, and so I disconnect so she can speak with them. 1 minute later, I see an update in the file, already hung in the backyard. The body is cold. He was right outside the window the whole time we were talking. A girl I graduated high school with went missing over the weekend when I was on my block. I took a call from someone that had seen her right after she went missing and gave a description and direction of travel. They don't find her. The next day we get a call of a body found hanging in the woods. It's her. Suicide. When I went on my lunch break, I made the mistake of looking at my Facebook wall and saw all the missing person posts, and a heartbreaking interview with her dad describing how unusual her disappearance was. She was a sweet girl, I remember going to the fair or carnival with her and friends when we were 14. As part of our training, we listened to some of the more intense calls. The worst one was one of a woman whose boyfriend shot her in the mouth. The call starts with a baby screaming and howling in the background and some gurgling and groaning from the woman. She's only half conscious and barely managed to dial. She was able to tell the call taker her boyfriend shot her and which way he went. She also kept repeating, "I'm going to die, I'm dying." The gurgling, sobbing, and constant howling is something I'll never forget. Apparently, she survived somehow though, so that's good. The woman in the apartment, sobbing uncontrollably, saying she could hear her neighbor screaming, "My baby is dead." The caller says she has 2 and 3-year-old kids. Once the police got there though, I saw the update that the deceased was like 50 to 60 years old though. So not entirely sure what was going on there. We had like 4 to 5 callers for that one, so the file was a mess. I'm off my break in a few minutes here, finishing the last 5 hours of my night shift. Wish me luck. I worked the UK equivalent, 999. My job was to route calls to fire, police, or ambulance. I had no medical training, and the calls that had me quit were as below. About 9 at night, a woman calls calmly, asking for an ambulance as her husband has passed out. After 10+ minutes of trying to get London Ambulance to answer the phone, she hangs up. I stay on the line, and another 10 minutes later, they answer. I relay the situation and address, and they confirm they'll do a drive-by, basically get the nearest available unit to visit the property, see what's happening. Half an hour later the same woman calls back, exact same reason for calling. Once again I'm on hold for London Ambulance to answer for 10+ minutes. Out of the blue she comes onto the phone and calmly says, "Don't bother, he's just died," and puts the phone down again. This time it doesn't disconnect, and I hear the most heart-wrenching wail of despair from the same woman. She then goes into a teary rant about how useless everything is and how London Ambulance killed her husband, before the line cuts off again. I got through to the ambulance service, explained everything, and the operator confirmed the drive-by got cancelled because the ambulance it was assigned to had finished their shift. I didn't sleep that night and cried more tears than I ever had done previously. The next day I went into the office an hour before my shift was set to start, emptied my locker, gave all my work stuff to my boss, and quit on the spot. Medical dispatch here. No call keeps me up at night, none. If you do this job and these things stick to you, you either won't last long, or your mind will deteriorate. You might wonder how I do it, and it's quite simple. I approach each and every call as a case-by-case problem. And each problem needs different solutions. To me, I don't help someone. I solve a problem. Sure, I feel empathy and anger sometimes, but it passes and disappears in a matter of seconds. In the end, I do my job as mechanically as possible, and it doesn't make a difference for the caller but changes the world for me and my health. It happened to a friend of mine, but it's something I always think of, and the thought just haunts me. We worked in the police emergency call center. She covered my shift as I wasn't feeling too good. She was working the day of the Christchurch mosque shooting. She said the phones were going off with people calling about the shootings. She spoke to a lady who was in the mosque. The lady was frantically screaming, and she could hear the gun going off and all the screaming in the mosques. The lady stopped screaming, but she could still hear what was going on in the mosque. She still has PTSD from the event and took time off work. We don't know who the lady was or where she is, but this call will always haunt us. It always scares me that that could have been me. Disclaimer, I'm not the operator that took the call but the one that had to make it on behalf of my next door neighbors. It was my first basic apartment after moving out and had been there maybe 2 months when a young couple with a new baby moved in next door. They were struggling, didn't have a phone because they couldn't afford it. I wasn't great off financially either but worked for an electronics retailer that sold Sprint after it had first come out and so got it for almost nothing to promote them to customers, so I never bothered with a landline. They didn't have good coverage in the area at the time so dropped calls were frequent at home, bad enough that calling my mom once a week on Sunday involved me taking a walk to avoid that. One night I get home late from work, make something to eat, start to relax, and sit down in front of the TV when I get a knock at the door. I had had a long day at work, it was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone, nor was I in a mood to talk to anyone, so I ignored the first knock. There were other college kids that lived there, and I thought it was the drunken wrong door sort of thing. I hear a knock on another door a second later, and I guess he got no answer there either because a minute later, he's back at my door pounding even harder. What the fuck man, it's late. I open the door, and he charges in a couple steps with this wild look in his eyes. I thought he was on something at first, so I went into defense mode. "Can I use your phone?" he asks. "I only have a cell phone that doesn't really work that well around here." "That's fine." I need to call 911. And then tears. My baby, I think he's dead. He almost shouted, dead. Oh shit. I grab my phone and dial, then hand it to him, sort of dumbfounded. I had to take it back from him and relay it to the operator. He was too distraught to get the address and details out, so I tried to stay calm and took the phone back. Yes, I'm the neighbor. This is the address. He just found his baby blue and not breathing in his crib, etc., all sort of detached. We were close to a fire station, so the operator gave me an ETA of just a few minutes, which I told him and motioned to him to head back over and stayed on until I could confirm emergency services arrived. I heard them wailing through the shared wall. Come on, breathe. I think they were trying CPR. The EMTs arrived and calmly started walking into my place with a stretcher. I had kept the door open in case the guy needed something else, so I had to direct first responder traffic, then explain to them and a cop that showed up what I knew about the situation. I never saw my neighbors again after that. A day or so later was my day off, and I got a knock early that afternoon. An older woman greeted me and said that she was the mom of my neighbor and asked me if I was the guy that called 911, said she wanted to thank me for making the call. I said it was no trouble, but I felt like a real asshole inside for not answering the first knock. I kept that last part to myself. I asked how he was doing, and she said, he didn't make it. She was fighting tears. She had just lost her baby grandson only a day and a half ago. Over the course of the day, his parents moved everything out. I guess it hurt too bad for my neighbor to go back in there. I didn't think to offer to help. I was too dumbfounded over the whole situation. It bothered me a lot, not offering to help with the moving and ignoring the first knock, and I didn't sleep very well for a few nights until I talked to my boss about why I was dragging at work. He was a volunteer sheriff's deputy in a neighboring county in his off time from the store, so he'd seen this kind of thing before, and assured me that by the time my neighbor found his son, it was probably already too late, but still. This was in '99, but I still think about them every so often, if they managed to stay together after, that sort of thing. I haven't been dispatching very long, so I am sure that I will have plenty of stories. But what immediately came to mind was a call I took the week after I started talking to people directly. An elderly man came on the line. His voice was slurred, and I had a hard time understanding his address. He apologized, and I told him it was because his phone was breaking up. He replied, "Oh. Well, I just wanted you to know that I am going to shoot myself in the head." We had a protocol, but my instinct was immediately to plead with him, to tell him help was on the way, and to get him to keep talking to me. I wasn't able to get 2 sentences out before I heard the shot. Dead on arrival. 2 hours later, I got a call from the same address. A woman was screaming that she hadn't heard from her father, a cancer patient, after his daily nap. She came to check on him and found a blood-soaked recliner in the backyard. I will never forget that stupid address or his voice. I worked for 411. I got fired because a girl called, begged me not to hang up on her. She could only function via a computer, and her computer was dead. All she wanted was a phone number to call HP. It took me half an hour, and our average call was 1.36 minutes. I had 5 different bosses from 5 floors come to yell at me. You should have hung up on her, charged her, and then she could just keep calling, is what they told me. Fuck that, I quit right then and there. No one is ever going to yell at me for helping another human being. No one, I don't care if you are a shareholder of TELUS. Uncle was a 911 dispatcher a couple of years ago. He said that most of the calls were pretty standard except for one. He gets a call at 7:30-ish at night. There's a woman sobbing, and she says that she found her son's suicide note. So, he's going through the steps, asking where she thinks he is when he hears a loud bang and then a thump followed by another loud bang and thump. The line is silent after that. Since this was a suicide, they had a police officer coming along as well. He heard the officer open the door, followed by him saying, "Holy shit." He then tells my uncle that there are 2 bodies, both with their heads blown off. Officers and paramedics arrive, and the call ends. My uncle was told the next day what happened. Apparently, this young adult was abused by his mother. He bought a shotgun, killed her, and then killed himself. My uncle quit soon after. So, I've been a fire control operator for 5 years. For the last 12 months, I've been a crew commander. I manage the control room and crew of 3 to 5 people. A couple of calls still sit funny with me. I'll list them in order of least bad to worst. My first suicide call. I was going through training with my then watch commander, and a colleague took a call. My quite harsh watch commander pointed at me and said, "You need to hear this," and I listened as my colleague took the details of the body of a young male who had been found hanging from a tree. That job sat funny with me because he'd only been deceased an hour or so, and I'd only been at work that long. The idea of these things happening as I go about my business really slapped me. It was a tough thing to process to start with. First, fire death. I took a call to a house fire issuing from the rear windows. Colleague took further calls making it persons reported. I dealt with lots of death in my job, including people dying after fires, but this one was out of the ordinary. We made record time to the job with crews and attendants in 5 minutes. The first message I took back from the job seemed pretty average. It was an assistance message asking for more crews, but the firefighter added on, completely against procedures, may I add, 1 casualty deceased, 1 serious burn, 1 minor burn. Those details are never passed on the radio, and everybody, including my watch commander, who's been in the job near 30 years, was visibly shocked by that message. Road traffic collision death. Emergency services work 24/7 here. I work over Christmas, and I worked Christmas Eve a few years ago, and I took a call to a road traffic collision. The call was from the police, and I heard the hurt in the voice of the police control operator that passed the call reporting a young lady who had been ejected from her car on the motorway and killed. Horrible job. I won't discuss details, but hearing my firefighters who have seen some shit on the verge of tears hurt my soul. I was okay with it for the most part. I went home Christmas morning and had a great Christmas, our first in our first home, Boxing Day. I had the TV on in the morning, and I heard them mention the incident. They said the victim's name, and she had the same name as my fiancé. I've had nightmares about the job ever since. I will never let it go. Knowing the descriptions I heard and all the things about the job, it hurts my heart. I've talked to people in a drug-induced psychosis, people setting fire to their own homes out of spite. I've had some calls from people in a serious mental health crisis. I've had hoax and malicious calls. 2 weeks ago, I successfully talked a man out of taking his own life whilst having a severe schizophrenic episode and taking a large overdose because he didn't want to speak to ambulance or police because he didn't trust them, so he called us. I'm not saying this for praise or thanks, but I just wanted to highlight the scale of the job we do. It's not just people in burning houses or car crashes. I'd like to add a highlight of my career so far, though. It's not all doom and gloom. I took a running call, a job the crew has come across whilst out and about, thinking it to be a road traffic collision. Much to my absolute joy, they discovered it wasn't a car crash, but a lady in labor, and I got to announce the birth of a lovely little girl who just couldn't wait to get to the hospital. I've also just been nominated for a Control Room Hero Award by one of my colleagues, which is cool. My dad is a paramedic in the UK. He told me that dead or dying babies are the worst calls to go to. You hear it on the radio, and your heart just sinks. There were 2 calls he told me about that has really stuck in my mind. One of them, a woman, had been cut in half by a train. Because of the positioning, she was still alive as the bleeding was plugged. When they moved her, she died. The second one was a 16-year-old girl who had died on the train tracks after touching the live rail. Dad said calls like that aren't uncommon because I was about 17 at the time. All he could think about was that it could have been me. I live in a high population area in Florida. I spend 48 to 56 hours a week taking nearly back-to-back 911 calls for almost 3 years now, and I don't have a single one that keeps me up. My job is to send the right help to the right place at the right time. I code and send the call to dispatch, I provide instructions to callers, and I know at the end of the day that my presence on the other end of the line has improved that person's chances of survival. I guess what I'm saying is, it isn't about me. It isn't personal. Crime, accidents, and illness are incredibly common, and as long as I did everything within my power to help, then I can sleep peacefully. Bonus, my favorite silly call was a lady who told me her 12-year-old wasn't breathing because his brother hit him in the chest. I'm providing CPR instructions, she's screaming, "My baby. My baby." It's tense right up until the paramedics arrived and figured out it was a dog and not a human child. I did CPR with her for like 3 minutes, Also, taking up a 911 line for stupid shit like that should be criminal. I love dogs as much as the next person, but no ambulance is gonna take your dog anywhere when they have 3 other emergency calls for humans waiting to go on. About a year and a half ago now, I received a call from a man that said his girlfriend was on the toilet and bleeding. I asked him if she was pregnant, which she was about 3 to 4 months along. I then asked to get her off the toilet, in which he does. As soon as he got her off the toilet, he saw his child in there. I proceeded to ask if the child was breathing, and he said it was. After about a minute went by of me trying to walk him through some instructions, he told me the baby stopped breathing. At this point, I provided him with CPR instructions, to which he seemed to do the best he could with them. I disconnected the phone when medics arrived on the scene and never found out the end result, but it can pretty much be assumed. My supervisor allowed me to walk that one off for a few minutes. My heart goes out to that man for being as calm as he sounded in that situation, because I have no idea how I'd react firsthand. I've also had multiple calls from people where their significant others shot themselves in the head. Also, a 16-year-old that was found in the woods by their parents. They hanged themselves. Many haunting calls, but none quite compared to the first, because I have absolutely no idea how I would react in that situation. One person called, and they wouldn't stop screaming, just screaming as loudly as they could. Then they hung up. I called back, but they never answered. Those screams echo in my head. I was training to be an EMT before I decided that it was too high stress for my personality. One of the student placements involved spending a night shift in the control room with an operator. Just as the morning was breaking, an elderly gentleman called us, bawling his eyes out. He said he'd woken up to find his wife of many decades cold and dead beside him in bed. I didn't stay long after that. Worked in a medical call center for a pathology lab. We handle incoming requests and call out urgent results such as life-threatening chemistry, hematology, or microbiology to the doctor and ward. Some that stand out. The baby was born septic at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Called the lab and asked to verify the life-threatening values ASAP, as the hematology and CRP values were sky high. Finally verified at 4:30 p.m. Send the doctor the results via SMS as per his instructions, call the ward, and a nurse answers. Go through my whole speech and the results, and she simply responds with, "You don't have to worry about that one." Hit me in the gut. Called a doctor with glucose on a patient that was twice the life-threatening limit, and she told me it was impossible. The patient is lucid and talking to her. I simply reply that a chempath and tech have verified the result, and she just drops the phone to tend to him. Called an ER doctor with a normal troponin T and read her a comment about follow-up testing being advised due to a delay in trop presenting after myocardial injury. She asks for a follow-up, I arrange it. I call her back after 40 minutes with a life-threatening value for the tro T. She just responds with thank you for catching what I should have. Have other stories about doctors and nurses and bad luck, but alas, they evade me now. My story is a very common thing many dispatchers may relate to. The guilt and the overwhelming feeling of sorrow and regret. It has been an average day. Nothing out of the ordinary. A call comes in on the emergency line. He's been stabbed. Okay, so I start reciting the script. Start going through the steps of checking for a pulse or breath while dispatching the closest ambulance. Reminding them to leave the stab wound and the knife alone. Then dispatch got back to me, and I found out the nearest ambulance was 37 minutes away. 37 minutes for a situation that needs immediate medical intervention. The woman is screaming on the phone, crying. I can hear a crowd gather around the boy's body. All screaming and crying. The ambulance didn't come on time. It was too late. I went back home and watched on the news of the story of the boy who got stabbed by a gang. I watched as the family cried at the loss of their boy. Guilt started to appear, as if I should have done more, or if it was my fault. I still haven't forgotten. It has stayed with me to this day. I'm not an operator anymore. I quit being one. Now I'm a handyman type anyway. I answer the call and hear a woman gasping for air. I asked her over and over, then I hear chalking and a man saying, "You bitch, you tried to call the police on me." A second later I hear screaming. I inform them and they figured out it is from New Mexico. To this day I still wonder how they called us in NYC. I was a dispatcher in the county, and the call was for the city. Simple silly so-and-so won't give me back my necklace. I transferred it to the city, and they dispatched on it. Turned out it was a domestic, and both officers were shot on arrival. One officer was dead immediately, and the other got to the hospital where his wife was an ER nurse on duty. That was 18 years ago. It wasn't even my department or my officers. This is something that happened on the 24th of this month. It's almost been a week. It was around 7 a.m. when I was walking to my car parked in the street, getting ready to leave off for work. When all of a sudden, I heard the most terror-filled scream coming from my friend's house, who only lived about 4 houses down. Immediately I got in the car and drove over, banging on the front door as hard as I could. Shortly she opened, covered in blood, and sobbing. I asked her what happened, and for the life of her, she couldn't muster a single word. All she could do was point to the back door. I moved her to the couch and sat her down, then ran to the backyard, and what I saw was horrifying. Her 12-year-old son was lying on the ground with a knife sticking out of his chest. I looked around for his dad, but he was nowhere to be found, I turned to my friend and asked her where he was, and she instantly began shaking. I knew exactly what happened by that point and calmly called 911. If you have never heard what an overdose sounds like, try imagining gargling and spitting sounds, as if someone is using mouthwash, but it's far more violent. Sometimes in a state of crisis, people will overdose and then call 911 so the operator listens to it. If this is the case, then the operator must stay in the line and send rescue services to the place in question, and cannot hang up until police and EMS arrives at the scene and can safely disconnect the call. It's beyond fucked up, but happens regularly, especially in the winter.